I have come to learn.
Sorry,
I have come to learn that everyone who lives in a city has important things to contribute. Next slide.
okay, hold on a second. This is telling me my screen sharing is paused. Resume. All right.
Thank you.
Whoop, I think we've
Yeah, one more. Yeah,
this
there
one.
you go. Stop now. I know it has a mind of its own sometimes. So the talk has four elements. First, I'm going to briefly walk you through the kind of knowledge base that urban designers have. And I hope this will give us a shared vocabulary and concepts to talk about, to understand the rest of the talk. Second, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own research in Gainesville, which I did largely through the University of Florida when I was teaching, but also since returning in other ways. Third, I'm going to go through a brief exercise analyzing Gainesville, because for designers, an analysis of the existing conditions is always the start of a design. You don't start with what you want, you start with what you have to begin with. And then fourth, the design of our preferred city, where I'll just mention a few ideas, which I hope will start a discussion. Next slide. So on the right is the book that you saw the cover of, The Design of Cities by Edmund Bacon. And the concept that this book helps us understand is that every city is unique. The way it grows, what all the factors are unique in every case. So we need to keep that in mind. On the left is a book called The City Shaped, and it calls up the ideas that cities have urban forms. And when you're trained to look at cities as an urban designer, you can begin to see and discern those forms. Next. Next is a book called Design with Nature by Ian McCard. And he developed the idea of using analysis and design to study natural areas in particular, but also cities, using systems and layers. So a system would be a large scale interconnected concept like infrastructure or the natural system or soils or something like that. And layers for architects were at that time putting pieces of paper, transparent paper, on top of each other and looking through them. What he did evolved into what we today know as GIS. So it's a very powerful tool for understanding cities. Next. The next book is The Image of the City, and he developed, he proposed that everyone proposed, based on his empirical research with many people, that we all understand places, we all understand cities through a common set of concepts: places, paths, edges, districts, and landmarks. And I'll talk about that more later. Next. The next book by Jane Jacobs is The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And among the other lessons from this book is that cities can and should be walkable and they should be safe. And her test case was Greenwich Village in Lower Manhattan, written during the time that Robert Moses was trying to drive a freeway through Lower Manhattan. Next. And then finally, Community Participation Methods in Design and Planning by Henry Sanoff, who was one of my professors. And this movement, which began during the 1960s and particularly focused on the fact that Black communities have been left out of planning processes, argues that communities have a right to have a say in the future of their own cities. Next. Also, for all people like me, urban designers, when we travel, we think of the city as a text. So on this map, and without going into detail, are the places in North America that I have lived, taught architecture studios, which would be studying one place for 4 months with 16 or 30 other people, or that I've traveled as a professional. And in all cases, when I visit each of those cities, or when I've lived in cities, I've applied all of the concepts that I showed you a few minutes ago to these cities. Next. And, you know, like many folks on the call, I've traveled quite a bit in Europe, some in South America, and a bit in Asia. Next. In Gainesville, I also did research because I believe that we have the obligation in my field to try to have an impact on the places that we live as well as on our students. So this is just 3 examples. I started teaching here in 1987, but particularly from 1996 to 2009, I probably taught 15 or 20 studios set in Gainesville. And each of those was therefore working with 16 or 25 really smart students to understand whatever part of Gainesville we were looking at. So on the upper left is an image from the historic courtyard charrettes on the UF campus, which led to the redesign and redevelopment of the historic courtyards, including the Plaza of the Americas. On the lower left is a student-led tour of Hibiscus Park done at the invitation of that group. And on the right, in the Florida Community Design Center, is a group of very happy students who just finished their final project, which was to look at the patch of ground between the University of Florida and downtown Gainesville. So they are staying in the downtown Gainesville area, and I took the picture from the University of Florida. The street straight ahead is University Avenue, and you can see that there's a lot of basswood construction student models, and those are at 6th Street and Southwest 2nd and University Avenue. And that project was done in about 2005. And so it preceded all the development of Innovation Hub Square and all of those apartments. The pitch that we made, that our students made to the community, and we did this after visiting Raleigh-Durham and Chapel Hill, North Carolina, all of which have, of course, universities located in towns, was that people will only walk so far. And what we figured out was that, that 6th Street is about halfway, of course, between the university and downtown. And we hypothesized that starting development from that point along those 2 streets and then letting it extend slowly both east and west would start to connect the university and downtown. And you can see that that has in subsequent years happened. Next. When I got back to Gainesville in 2014 or 15, I also began, I had the time to do things that were just kind of randomly interesting, and I was trying to relearn Gainesville. So I started following a number of Facebook pages, but 3 in particular that are focused on local issues. I continue to follow, and I learn from them all. On the left is the Gainesville New Urbanism website, where there are very lively conversations about development in Gainesville, especially downtown. In the center is a group called Gainesville Word of Mouth. You can see that the day I took the screenshot, they were interested in some kind of car racing thing, something I have no interest in or knowledge of. So it gave me a slice of the community that I would not have had through my own predilections. And Eat Gainesville, which talks exclusively about places to go out and eat in Gainesville. So each of them is a snapshot of Gainesville, but seen from different perspectives. And I think that in understanding a city, because cities have people who are unlike each other, it's really important to understand a variety of perspectives, not just your own. And as an urban designer, that's essential. Next. Also in around 2018, as some of you know, there was a very heated discussion about affordable housing. And when the city did not organize a good means for community to have input, a bunch of us did it ourselves. And so about 50 people got together over several months and developed a 1-page draft comprehensive affordable housing proposal for Gainesville with good ideas. And it was a very diverse group. So there were ideas that came forward that I would never have thought of, and I probably put forward ideas that others would not have thought of. We presented this to members of the City Commission and to the County Commission and asked that they take up the question, give us a public hearing, etc. The City Commissioners declined, but next slide. there we go. The county commissioners were agreeable. So we presented our ideas to the county commission and they said, what would you most like to do? And we said, we would like to develop understand the community, build the data first. And so with the Alachua County staff in 2020, about 10 of our original group of 50 met with county staff and helped them develop an interactive map. So this is a screenshot that's called the Housing Resources Map for Alachua County, and it's interactive in that same layered way. So on this slide, you can see I've checked a bunch of the boxes. And next slide. Here I've given two examples of what particular people might look for. On the left is a slide that checks multifamily complexes. And on this map, the county checked multifamily complexes of 10 or more units only. So this does not show 2 to 10 units, only 10 units or more. It shows RTS routes and it shows elementary school zones. So this might be an example of a single parent who needs to take the bus to work and has small kids, and they want to make sure that they're in the best possible elementary school zone. This would help them find a house. On the right is another scenario, someone I know who needs financial assistance, has serious health problems and needs to be near medical facilities. She can't drive, so she needs to be on RTS routes, and of course, grocery stores that are convenient. She's in a wheelchair would be important. So this is that scenario. So it was intended the city conceived it to attend to both their citizens who might use this, and I thought of it and others thought of it as a way for county commissioners to understand what we already have. So when we make moves to add more housing or do other things, we would know what we're working with to begin with. Next slide. As some of you know, I have been writing editorials for the Gainesville Sun. I'm thankful for the monthly opportunity to do that. And I've actually been doing it on and off since 1991. And always on urban design. So, and for each one of those, of course, I think about things with a fresh perspective, sometimes do research or go visit a place. So that's a form of research. Next, please. And then about 2 years ago, with another group of 50 people, probably some overlap with previous collective projects, we developed a website called Gainesville Neighborhoods United. And this is a screenshot of the homepage. And next slide. And these are screenshots of 3 different neighborhoods. Our goal is to ultimately make all of the known neighborhoods in Gainesville have active in that they would have their own interactive page. These are 3 examples from different parts of Gainesville. In one case, the residents provided the text and I took the photographs. In another, we met with a group of 10 residents who talked about their neighborhood and the places that were important, and then we shaped it. And in another case, a friend and I, Carroll Estates, a friend and I did this page without the help of anyone in Carroll Estates. And for me, what's been interesting with this whole project, and I'm the webmaster because I have relatively more technical skill, although it's not all that much. What's been interesting is seeing how many neighborhoods there are and how diverse they are and how interesting they are in their own ways. Next, please. And then since I came back, I have developed a painting practice, a studio practice. And so this is an example of a project called Watershed Anecdotes, which is focused on the Hogtown Creek watershed. So doing this, I had the opportunity to figure out where all rain falls in the Hogtown Creek watershed and where it flows to. And I think my friend Carrie Oliver Smith is here. She very kindly helped organize the exhibit, and I was very appreciative of that. Next, please. Okay, now we move into a very quick analysis of Gainesville. So when an urban designer begins thinking about a problem, if they're lucky, they get to define the problem themselves. Sometimes that's done in advance by a client, but I got to define what I think we should be looking at when we consider Gainesville. So the area in purple or lavender is the current city limits of the city of Gainesville. But as I have reflected and thinking about the Facebook page, Gainesville Word of Mouth and Eat Gainesville and so forth, I think that the real Gainesville urban area, is this map. So on the far left, you see a little jog in a main road. That is where Jonesville and Tioga are. And of course, on the far right is Noonan's Lake. On the north is still within the city limits, and on the south, as you'll see, is Paynes Prairie. So I think when we consider the design of our community, and I'm not speaking obviously as an elected official who works for one part of the community or another, but as a citizen who lives in Gainesville, I think this is our site area. Next, please. So that's the map that I used as my base map. This is a simple hand drawing of the watersheds in Gainesville. And you can see that there are at least 2 major watersheds, actually 3, that inform the growth of Gainesville. On the right or east is Noonan's Lake. And I didn't know until I did this drawing how extensive the Noonan's Lake watershed is or how far west it goes. And the reason to do analysis because not to confirm your assumptions, but to learn things. So this was very interesting to me. On the left is the Hogtown Creek watershed that starts north by the Walmart on 441 and drains into Lake Kanappaha and then disappears, which is a particular Florida phenomena. And on the south, you see drainage into Paynes Prairie. Next, please. Next is the paths or streets, and this is again using the vocabulary of Kevin Lynch. This is a map that probably most of us would be somewhat familiar with. So you can see on the diagonally on the left-hand side of the screen is I-75. On the right, going from upper right to lower left, is Waldo Road that becomes Williston Road and Archer Road. And going sort of straight across the middle of the screen is University Avenue itself. And you can see, and let's go to the next slide, please. So here I've layered the water layer and the street layer, but I removed the base layer. So here we can see why it is that that the city was founded where it was. It's because it's on high ground in between the Hogtown Creek watershed and the Noonan's Lake watershed. You can also see from this that the size of the major grid, so in between those two, we have from right to left, we have Waldo Road, Main Street, 6th Street, and what we call 13th Street today. You can see that that major grid of streets is tighter than the grid further to the west. And that's a reflection of some of the things that friends in new urbanism have concerns about, and I do, the use of automobiles, the size of streets, the size of lots and things like that. So pre-World War II is essentially between Hogtown Creek and Noonan's Lake. Post-World War II is west of Hogtown Creek or to the left of Hogtown Creek. Next, please. This looks at edges and boundaries also from the Kevin Lynch taxonomy. And the greenish color is natural boundaries. So on the upper left is San Velasco Hammock. On the bottom is Paynes Prairie. You can see the Hogtown Creek, portions of the Hogtown Creek watershed that are protected. And that's either because they're low and swampy or a couple are in parklands as well. And on the right, there's quite a lot of protected land around Noonan's Lake. So you can begin to see why there's less development in East Gainesville, because there's a lot of land that is protected. And it is probably in some cases because it's lowlands and wouldn't be buildable anyway. And in other cases, it's protected because it's someone protected it, for the watershed of Noonan's Lake. There are also kind of golden sections. If you know Gainesville, you probably know that the University of Florida is kind of smack in the middle of the screen. And that's an edge or a boundary because we can't build into the University of Florida. On the upper left is a little triangle, that's the Santa Fe campus. And on the upper right is the Tacachale campus, the fairgrounds, and the county jail and so forth in between. So those two are not available for development, and those are considerations. Next, please. And then finally, in the Lynch terminology, a place is sort of a recognized known activity center. Some planners call them activity centers. And I identified about 33 just intuitively. This could be done with data, how many car trips to these places, how many taxes are produced and so forth, because they're all places where, most of them are places where people eat, meet, shop, etc. They include the area right in the center of campus. You can see, just for orientation, the arrow is now pointed toward the area near Royal Park and the public shopping center at University and 34th Street. Just below that is a very large area, that's Butler Plaza. To the far left along University Avenue is Jonesville and Tioga, just to kind of orient you. But basically, these are intuitive on my part. I also included some, like I included the Satchels area. It's been interesting to see over the last 15 years, however long they've been open, how they have developed a kind of a community in that area. So there are now other places, vibrant places near Satchels, whereas when Satchels developed, it was sort of in the middle of nowhere, as some of you will remember. Next, please. Now this layers all of those maps. So we see the watershed, the major streets, and the places all together, but without the base map. And for me, this is the map that I have now in my head after having done this, of our community that we should be considering the design of. Next, please. There is a concept that's been developed by followers of Jane Jacobs and others who are advocates of walking, and as I am. And typically it's described as a 20-minute city where you can get you should ideally be able to get where you need to get within 20 minutes walking. And that is a 1 mile radius is the metric that planners use. So these are 1 mile circumferences around all of these activity centers. I was telling my husband about this map and the 1 mile walks, and he was saying that he thought that that might be further than most people would walk. And as we reflected, I agreed. And so my next slide, next please, is probably more realistic. These are 8 to 10 minute walks. It happens that this is something like 4/10 of a mile, the circumference is. And if we pick one, for instance, many people know the University context area. So right in the middle of the map on University Avenue, to the right, Abe, that one. That is sort of, he's got the arrow on Tigard Hall, more or less. And so if you think about how far people would normally walk, it's probably, you know, sort of about half that distance if you were shopping or, you know, doing daily activities. And that is, of course, if you're healthy and it's not raining and it's not super hot and so forth. So next slide, please. This is what I think of as Gainesville's realistic walk sheds, more or less. And so my hypothesis now, or my proposal for discussion today, is that these are Gainesville's realistic walk sheds, as they are called, and that these are Gainesville's urban villages. And I counted about 33 when I did this map. There could be more, there could be fewer, but there are a lot of them. Next, please. So now shifting into the design element. Some designers use the simple definition, design is the creation of a preferred future. So the question then becomes, what is our preferred future? For me, it needs to consider sustainability, and the basic definition that's often used is meeting today's needs without compromising the needs of future generation. That comes from a United Nations report. And it defines a triple bottom line of ecology, economy, and social equity, that those things should be in balance to have a sustainable development pattern. As climate change has gotten more challenging, some of us have started also attending to the concept of resilience. This is generally the capacity of an ecosystem to respond to perturbation or disturbance by resisting damage and recovering quickly. And so those of us who are very concerned about climate change believe we need to not only build and consider sustainability, but also resilience in times of unrest and crisis. Next, please. So in our area, and of course, every part of the globe is different for lots of reasons, including geographic location. We in Gainesville, Florida, face certain kinds of threats. We can expect to see more severe storms and therefore the disruption of infrastructures. We can expect to see more extreme heat. We will probably at some point have a loss of energy resources, either because grids go down during hurricanes or we run out of oil, et cetera. We will therefore we should anticipate reduced access to supply chains, and as comes with things like that, and as we have seen even with COVID here, societal disquiet or unrest. So how might we in Gainesville, Florida respond? I would suggest that at least a few things we would do would be, we would want to reduce our energy needs and usage. And this includes, at the scale of a building, daylighting, so that if you don't have power, you can still see deep into a building. Cross ventilation for the same reason if there's not air conditioning or not regular air conditioning, and obviously walking when possible. Next is we would strengthen local capacities, and that includes gardens so we can feed ourselves. It includes what are called microgrids that are detachable from larger grids, so that in some places that have the capacity to be solar supported or sustained, you could have a detachable grid. You would also have local sources for everything possible, as communities did 100 years ago. And we would consider, in an area like ours that's relatively flat and prone to flooding and severe rainstorms, low impact development, which means holding stormwater on site so that it can sink into the ground where it is rather than flooding. And we would want to strengthen social bonds. And that's why I'm so interested in neighborhoods, because a neighborhood for me is a social unit where people tend to know each other. And that's an important social bond in a time of crisis. Third places are like the TV show Cheers, where everyone knows your names. These are places where you go and you have a community that's not where you work and it's not where you live. It's a third place. And what are sometimes called second-degree friendships, that includes, and that's just kind of building a network of social trust so that if you need it, it's there. These are people like the person who checks you out at the grocery store, the person that you see on your walks every day, though you never see them in any other context, people like that. Next, please. So we might then begin by applying those concepts to strengthening our 33 plus urban villages. That means, in my mind, that we would do what we could to make them walkable. We would want them to be shaded because that does make them more walkable. They would contain local shops when possible, because that would keep our money in the community, and it would perhaps allow for local sourcing. When possible, we would produce energy. We would both manage our water and celebrate water, because that's an important facet of Gainesville's terrain. We would make housing that's accessible in several meanings of the term. It would be accessible to people who are not physically able to get around. So that means one floor flats for some people. It means cheaper housing for some people. And it means accessible to daily needs when possible. And we would provide within these villages access to needed services. And that includes things like daycare centers, medical facilities, laundromats, grocery stores, green space, et cetera. So here are a few examples in Gainesville. Just, you probably know most of these. On the upper right is the Hale Village Center. On the lower right is a restaurant that's just opened on North 34th Street called Nopal. And the balcony is set over the headwaters of the Hogtown Creek, which is a lovely setting that celebrates our local nature. And on the left, near 34th Street and University, is the backyard, so to speak, of a burrito shop on the Hogtown Creek. And I like thinking about the fact that the lower right-hand side and the lower left-hand side are the same river in different locations. And I think to kind of conceive of our community as one entity, all of us would help us appreciate it more. Next, please. A quick tour through 4 neighborhoods. These are all 1 mile squares. I selected 4 areas that are, I hope, non-controversial at the moment. And I just want to talk about applying how we might begin to apply those concepts in any or all of our 33 neighborhoods. So this is downtown. There's a thin red line that you can see going from the center to the edge. The center of that image is University Avenue and Main Street. And so you can see that near the very center of downtown, there are taller buildings. I happen to know that on this slide, there is multifamily housing like Union Street Station and the area behind the Commerce Building, as well as the Siegel Building. There's an assisted living facility. There are a number of student apartments on the left near 6th Street. And then on the 4 quadrants are Gainesville's 4 oldest neighborhoods: the Duck Pond on the upper right, the Southeast Historic District, Porter's Quarters on the lower left, and Pleasant Street and 5th Avenue on the upper left. And so you see what this area looks like. You can see that the tree cover is in the neighborhoods. There is far less tree cover downtown. To some extent that could be corrected, but there is a stark distinction, and there is a variety of housing types in this urban village, let's call it. Next, please. This is Northwest 13th Street and 16th Avenue. The center of that, just to the left, lower left of the center, is the supermarket that used to be Aldi's. I think it's now maybe a Winn-Dixie. There are a lot of other stores in here that have been various things through the years. And around the periphery, we have to the right, lower right, we have multifamily housing complexes. To the far right and upper right, we have single family housing complexes. And then along the left-hand side of the screen, we have apartment complexes. Gaineswood is in this view, Hobbit's Glen and Cumberland Circle. So in theory, all of those should be walkable to that shopping center. But I suspect that if you have a choice, you do not walk to it. And you can see why. It's because it's a kind of bleak asphalt desert in the center. But it's an area that has promised to be renovated or redeveloped in a more positive way. Next, please. This is in the center of the screen, the front door of the Walmarts, just off of Waldo Road, just north of the Duval neighborhood. To the east is Cedar Grove neighborhood. To the west is what's called Old Northeast. And to the north of Walmart is the Tacachale campus, which at some point will be redeveloped as something, as in time that I understand will shut down. Just north of the Walmart is a green line. That's actually what I've always thought of as a drainage ditch, but that is one of the headwaters of Noonan's Lake. And so as we think about redeveloping an area like Walmart, which is potentially, whatever we think of its produce or its politics, it sells everything, and a lot of people appreciate the price points. It has 5 retention ponds around it and the headwaters of Noonan's Lake. That could be an amazingly beautiful naturalized area if it were redeveloped in that way or reconceived of in that way. Next, please. And then finally, Tower Road and Archer Road. The red line in the center is at a public supermarket, a typical public shopping center supermarket. Just left of that is a relatively new multifamily development, in fact, 2 of them. One of them is a gated community and one is an ungated community, but they're both multifamily. To the lower right is a mobile home park. To the upper left is a single family development. And so this area, again, it's you can see there's a lot of asphalt, and Tower Road at this place, if you know it, is 6 lanes of traffic with no crosswalk. So getting from any of the multifamily housing across Tower Road would be dangerous, basically. But it has promise, and I think that it could be developed as an urban village. Next, please. So at this, I've showed you some individual villages. Now, how might we consider connecting them into one city? We would think about transportation networks, social networks, digital networks, and energy networks. On the upper right, upper left is a quick map of connecting lines to some of the major urban centers. And when I look at it, I think of it as a subway map, and that these might be places that major bus lines connect in the way that the express trains in a major city would connect. So you could, for instance, leave your car in at Tower Road and then take a bus into town, as you do now. But you might also, and I'm not a transportation planner, so if there are any on this call, they're probably freaking out as I talk because I don't know what I'm talking about here. But I could imagine a system that would connect these networks in the way that subways do work. So you don't always have to go through the center of town to get wherever you want to go. And in the lower left is just kind of a conceptual diagram that I titled A Thicket of Networks, because there are all kinds of connections across the people who live and shop and work in these places. And I think that that in a resilient community could be highlighted. Next, please. And finally, in terms of what we might do, we would strengthen all local capacities, citywide and neighborhood-wide. So we have strengths in lots of areas in Gainesville. In terms of food production, the farmers market network, just this one example, is strong. We could think about and should think about our energy production, also our water management, including potable water, wastewater, and stormwater, and our social resilience, drawing on community strengths. When I showed this slide before, someone reminded me of our park system, which is extremely robust. Almost every neighborhood has a park. It's incredible. We have a great library system similarly. So there are lots of networks in place that we could just start to think about as ways to connect these neighborhoods while we're still strengthening them individually. Next, please. So what that might mean on the upper 3 slides are the last place I showed you the plan of. It included the Publix on the upper right at Tower Road and Archer Road. And across that 6 lanes of traffic is a tiny little urban center with about 5 stores that are trying to make it, and then 3 stories of multifamily housing. And so far, it's definitely not pedestrian friendly, and it's not a place you'd probably want to hang out. But the lower slides, as you probably, some of you recognize, include the area near the 4th Avenue Food Park, and there is multifamily housing across the street. So for instance, and it's, I think, probably done, particularly the food park, with a kind of a creativity and energy and vision that could be learned by others. So what if the Publix on the upper right tore out about 10 parking spaces and installed a food park with food trucks instead, for example? And how might that redevelop that area to be not just a place where you shop, but a place where you hang out locally and that you walk to? Next, please. And one of my favorite relatively new places in Gainesville is Curia on the Drag, which is on 6th Street, just south of 23rd. If you've been there, and if you know the before and after, it was a series of extremely nondescript little buildings. The architecture was no big deal, but again, the creativity of the people who have redeveloped it and their ongoing creativity in programming it make it a really special spot that has the kind of tangled layers and funkiness that I think many people like about Gainesville. On the upper left is one of my favorite shopping centers in Gainesville, the Creekside Mall, favorite architecturally. It speaks to the Florida climate. It has deep overhangs that provide shading and protection from rain. It has indoor-outdoor spaces. The spaces inside have abundant daylight, but it seems never to take off somehow. And I've, in all the time I've lived here, I would say that's been the case. And I can only think that it's, it's also the format of Millhopper, which is quite, the Millhopper shopping center, which is quite successful. And I think it's that the people who are developing successful shopping or gathering experiences are not the people who are managing the Creekside Mall and other places. So I think one of the networks we might develop would be our own local entrepreneurial talent where they might learn from each other. I know both of these places and I compare them because my yoga studio is Searchlight Yoga, which is located in the Creekside Mall. But Curia on the Drag hires them to teach classes once a week at Curia. So they are populating their space through programming. And that is the kind of thing that smart entrepreneurs and developers do that could activate some of these 33 spaces that are not yet activated. And final slide. And Martha, this is for you, Martha Cohen. When Martha arrived in Gainesville from Uruguay, she, of course, as an urban designer, did the things that all of us do as urban designers. And she wondered what the deal was with Noonan's Lake. Why wasn't Noonan's Lake a really valuable part of our consciousness of Gainesville? And I agreed with her then and do now. We see where all of our active places are. Noonan's Lake, as some of you know, has had continuous settlement for 5,000 years. It has the oldest record of human habitation that I know of anyway in North America. And it's just this funny little place at the end of University Avenue. And if you get there, it's a spectacular lake. It also, I think, has the capacity to draw people to Eastern Gainesville who aren't coming there now. So when we look at cities, we need to think about not just what can we fix that we don't like, but where are there opportunities? And for me, that's a question mark waiting to be answered. And that's my talk. So I look forward to conversation.
Okay, I've stopped sharing. If you, Kim is willing to continue discussing and answering questions and dealing with, various discussion related and more distantly related issues. If you want to say something, to raise a question, the best way to do this is if you see on the bottom of your Zoom screen, the link that says reactions. If you click that on the bottom of that, it allows you to raise your hand. And that way we'll get a nice queue of people ready to ask questions. And I see Martha Cohen is already ready to do so.
Okay, thank you very much, Abby. I would first say thank you, Kim, for this very comprehensive look into our broader community. I have 2 points. I mean, we could discuss forever, but yes, I have 2 points. One is, what is the tendency? Have you looked at the development tendencies for the city and the broader context on the county, and how does that impact in the sense of allowing our neighborhoods and our central areas to be revitalized rather than dispersion into the suburbs? That's one question. And the second one is regarding the third case that you were looking into Gainesville, where Walmart is. I recently saw in the press, and I had heard before, Commissioner Chestnut talking about the 34 acres of municipal land that is there, and how that could become one of your activity centers that you're thinking of?
Two good questions, no surprise. In terms of the tendencies toward development and redevelopment, and I think that's kind of a push-pull that we have in the state of Florida. When I first arrived in Gainesville, I met someone who it turned out, well, I met someone at a party and I asked him what he did. And he said he was a farmer. And then he said with a sly grin, I farm Yankees 6 to the acre, meaning he was a developer. And I think that if you look at the history of Florida, at least post World War II, that is its history. So there is, and that's, I think we're seeing even more so now in Gainesville and Alachua County, and it really across Florida. For, we have one of my favorite realtors, Jean Chalmers, is here on the line, and others can talk about the continuous push to develop all land, because that's how developers make money. Most developers make money. We have some fantastic redevelopers in the city. So there's that tendency. And then I think that there is in a well-intentioned goal of retrenching in a way so that people can walk, as I hope you saw that I think that's important too. But I don't think that there are very many people who know how to do that in Gainesville. One of my colleagues, and Martha, you may know Ellen Dunham Jones, who teaches at Georgia Tech, wrote several books called Retrofitting Suburbia. And there are great examples from across the country that she and others have identified of reinventing stripped shopping centers and making them vital. And so I do not see that happening very much. I think Curia is a little version of that. And really the 4th Avenue Food Park is in a rehab shopping center from the probably 50s. So we have a few good examples, but I would say it's not widespread. And everyone who does that kind of work, I'm sure, would tell you it takes incredible effort. And which is why we have, places like 13th Street and 16th Street that are languishing as they are, because nobody has taken them in hand. The leasing agent isn't going to do that. And so I think that that's an area where others, and I hope that through conversations like this, we can develop the will to move forward on things like that. So to summarize, we continue to push out. There isn't a goal to retrench, but there is not the means to do that at this point. Regarding the East Gainesville question, Commissioner Chestnut, I believe, has been and Desmond, Commissioner Duncan Walker too, have been advocating for doing something more active with the, I think it's the Martin Luther King Center, which is kind of across the street from Walmart. I think that's the site you're referring to. And I think that to conceive of the Walmart and to kind of re-envision Walmart along with that site makes a lot of sense. I'd also note, because I see Sarit Sella on the call, Sarit is the city's architect, and she, I talked to her several years ago about the Kelly Activity Center, I think it's called, which is in Duval, is in the process of being rebuilt by some of our favorite former students, Martha. And so thinking about Walmart plus the Martin Luther King Center plus the Kelly Center and that connection to the Duval neighborhood. And Commissioner Duncan Walker has also talked about perhaps repurposing the Duval Elementary School, which is kind of in that same area, for an arts center. I think there's the potential to activate that far more than it is. And I support those goals.
Okay. I see JBHFL is waiting to say something. Could you let us know who you are other than those initials?
Yes, hello, Abe. I'm Jane Berman-Holton. How are you doing?
Oh, yes. Hi.
At one time, we tried to get into UPNA because we are part of the university context area. So Kirkwood and Cochlear, we're kind of down south. Anyway, my question really is, what about the rest of the city? It's rather like, should maybe it's a good idea to focus on those 33 and get development there, and then leave the rest to kind of sit quietly. I'm a bit concerned about, I like the idea of the focus, and I love the idea of the activity centers because they're like living human scale places to be. But my concern is what happens in the rest. So that'd be my question for Kim.
Well, Jane, as you know, I'm just a random citizen, so I'm not going to do anything other than talk or write about these things. I'm not going to buy any of them. I'm not a developer. So I think what I hope to do is to stimulate conversations, and my hope would be that people who are in positions to make a difference might pick up their own. I agree with you that focus for a person or an entity is a good thing, but across the city of Gainesville is just the city, that area in purple is 64 square miles. And that's compared to the city of Paris, that's 48 square miles. The area that I showed you is probably 2.5 times the size of the city of Paris. So I think several things can happen at once in an area this big, and some of them are almost already happening. That's what Gainesville Neighbors and or whatever that Gainesville Word of Mouth and Gainesville Eats, those websites tell me that people are focusing, like I found out about the Nopal restaurant, which has fantastic Mexican food, by the way, on some Facebook site. And so I think that individuals can do what they're going to do in those different places. And in time, if we value all of them, they will emerge according to their own organic character. And I think that's better than, first of all, the city and county obviously would have to work together on anything as wide as this context area because it spans the municipal boundaries. But I think that there are limits to what cities can do and should do. And I really do think that this, I think Satchels has done more for Northeast Gainesville than any city commission ever did, for example.
Okay. Christian Newman, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thank you. Dr. Tanzer, that was very interesting. And actually, that's actually the first time that I've seen someone sort of lay out some of like the ecological reasons why things are where they are. So I really appreciate that because I think that really does drive, just does drive a lot of where we kind of are. So I want to ask you sort of two things, and two. So one of them, you sort of indicated there was a point in time when you wanted to sort of present or sort of engage with the city and the county, and the county was the only taker in terms of engaging with you. When was that?
Well, I would say the last 4 years in every case, but we started that particular project in the spring of 2019. That was after the city had advocated for Gainesville Rise that was supposed to provide affordable housing. That failed. And then they were going to come back and have an opportunity for workshops. And when they didn't, a bunch of us just said, well, let's tell them what we think they should do. So that was that particular case was 2019.
Okay, thanks.
Let me just say for all of the PhDs on the call that I am not a PhD. I appreciate the recognition, but I'm happy to be called Kim.
Okay, Kim, thank you. Thank you. No, I sometimes people call me doctor for various reasons. And I'm like, no, I'm not.
Exactly.
So, and actually just the other, the other question I have a lot of questions for you, but I'm just going to stick with one. So one of the things that, I don't know, can you talk a little bit about basically maybe the reasons that, I don't know if you kind of looked into why I-75 was put where it was and what impact that had on a lot of the things that we're sort of seeing. It's, to me, I feel like that's also a major kind of historical thing that happened that, that again, we just kind of have to sort of deal with, but, that it's basically sucked so many things out west. And, there may be some legitimate ecological reasons why developing on the east side hasn't happened, but it also seems to me that there's also some historical land use decisions that were made to make that happen. Just be curious to hear you talk about that.
Absolutely. And you're right. Absolutely. I had students, this is the blessing of working with university students. About 15 years ago, I had them do a series of historic maps of Gainesville. And I myself have done that through Sanborn Maps for as long as you can. It's a kind of a two-part answer. I think that the first westward push, if you look at Gainesville before 1905, which I did just recently with Sanborn Maps, it was very much centered in downtown. And there was curiously a kind of a new development just slightly east of downtown that had a different street pattern. There's still remnants of it in place. So at that point, Gainesville, if anything, was moving east. In 1905, the university was given a big chunk of land where it currently is, and that began the westward shift. And so that led to, faculty housing being there and so forth. And then the interstate came through, I think, in the 70s. And if you look at a geological map of Florida, you will see that it runs down the high point of Florida, which is also a rock formation.
Right.
And that's why the interstate is where it is. And you're absolutely right that, of course, as happens in every city, new businesses move toward the interstates. And so that led to the Oaks Mall in, I think, the 1980s and so forth and so on. And then hydrologically, it is true that west of Hogtown Creek, for the most part, the land, the Alachua County Property Appraiser site has a series of interactive maps. It's very interesting. So you can pull up all of the watersheds in the county, and you will see that there are FEMA floodplains and low-lying areas far more in the east than in the west. And that's part of it as well. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't other reasons that people chose to relocate west. And I think the other thing that was so striking when I did those little maps myself of the major watersheds is I began thinking about, what did the drainage ditch essentially behind Walmart look like when it was naturalized? There's sweet little creeks throughout Gainesville that are seen as amenities. But in East Gainesville, and I'm aware of several in East Gainesville, they're just channelized ditches, which are not charming. And so a different developers who were attending to the beauty of nature might have done something different with those drainage channels.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna talk anymore, but one of the interesting things about a lot of like those drainage channels, like they were put in there to basically dry land out so people could develop. So a lot of the things that we sort of see are results of that too. So they weren't, long time ago, they were just trying to make it drier so they could build something or make it easier for them to put in forestry and all that other stuff. So anyway, thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you. Janice, Gary?
Hi, Kim, it's so good to see you, and I so appreciate this 30,000-foot look at Gainesville. It's just so enlightening. And Abe, I wanted to thank you for welcoming me. I'm new to the group, and Abe got me the connection. So promptly, here I am sitting with everybody, and I appreciate it. So Kim, I'm good. At the risk of sticking my foot in my mouth yet another time, could you kindly help me understand the recent brouhaha about transect zones and lessening them below 10 acres? Because all the urban communities and what have you, you're describing, I don't know about that stuff, except that I live in Oakview neighborhood, which has all the features of one of those little urban communities. So to my layman's eye, when I heard about making more transect zones, it sounded like an opportunity for more people in Gainesville to have exactly the kind of walkability, local places and what have you. So can you please help me understand the cons to that and help me understand that issue?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, first of all, let me say that when I was involved with the Florida Community Design Center for 10 years, from 1999 when it started to 2009. And sometimes I would be sort of manning the station. So I would be working in the design center, which was located next to the Chamber of Commerce and the Commerce Center. And somebody who owned a piece of land would walk in. And he would inevitably say, this is a really great piece of land and we need to have a microbrewery here, or we need to have a such and such here, because he owned that property and he could envision what he thought it should be. And if he were a real developer, he'd also want to make more money by getting whatever that was to be on his property. And oh, by the way, he usually wanted free student design help to get it there. So what that led me to realize was that everyone, I mean, when I drive around town, I could think, oh, that would be a great place to have a such and such. Everyone has those visions of what would be cool in a certain place, but you can't do all of them. That kind of goes back to Jane's question about let's focus. The argument or the question before the city commission recently was, should we allow what they called a transect zone of fewer than 10 acres to be permitted? So 10 acres, and I was just looking at this to give you some sense of how big that is. If you think about all of the Publix in Gainesville, some of them are 15-acre sites. The one at 34th Street and University is 5 acres. So a developer could walk in to, a city official and persuasively make the case that a random 5-acre site anywhere felt like a transect to him, like what they're calling a transect. And so that can happen everywhere. Obviously, as I said, we've got, something like 33. How many more do we need? But let me explain what transect zoning is and what a real transect is. So new urbanists came up with the idea of the analogy of an ecological transect, which goes from one ecological system to another slowly through space. And the example in the New Urbanism Smart Code is a dune going from the water to the sand, to the primary dune, to the secondary dune, and then to maybe a forest beyond that over a limited period of time. But in a natural transect, you wouldn't carve out, a little chunk of forest and plunk it down in the sand next to the ocean, because it wouldn't thrive there. It wants to be next to other forests. That's the concept that they conceived of to consider how the form of cities typically grows. And if you look at historic cities, indeed, they're taller in the center. They typically would start and get a little bit taller and denser in the center, and then they become less dense and more rural toward the outskirts. So the new urbanists drew a section through an idealized city going from rural, a building now and again, to more buildings, suburban, to more buildings, to center city, and back down. That's what an architect calls a section, a slice through a city. You could look at that in plan, and it would be kind of like idealized concentric rings out, where the outside would be less developed and the inside would be more developed. And that makes a lot of sense. And we can talk about how Gainesville does or doesn't fit that pattern. But what that particular ordinance would have done is it would have said you could carve out, you could take what the way the term has been used recently by policymakers in Gainesville is to say you could have a transect zone of under 10 acres. In fact, in new urbanism language, everything is in one transect zone or another. But in new urban language, you would never take an urban zone, which might have buildings up to 6 or 8 stories, and plunk it down in a rural area, because it wouldn't be like anything else around it. And that's why the first page of their code is on that concept. And that's why I was among the people that fought against it, because it's counter to new urbanism. And basically what it does is distort the city in favor of people who own particular pieces of property that they want to make more valuable. And I would say that has probably happened more often than it should already. But if you look at the map that I drew, most of what I described as villages or activity centers are at the cross sections of major streets. So they are where there's a lot of traffic, whether it's bus traffic or car traffic. They are, you know, like Millhopper and the Publix at 34th Street and the Oaks Mall, Butler Plaza. Those are all located at logical places. And if you zoned to get density where there are likely to be the most people, those all do make sense.
Would it be okay if I ask a follow-up?
It's okay with me.
Yes, sure.
Okay. So in my layman's eye, when I look at something like that, and I did, when I was looking at that ordinance, I did, you know, look some stuff up. I did my Google work. So now I'm an expert. But in my layman's eye, I thought the same thing you did when you and your husband had that conversation about what's walkable. I mean, quite honestly, people have just gotten so used to those cars. If you don't make something within, I agree, you know, 8 to 10 minutes, and they're just not going to walk there. And fortunately, as you know, Kim, I live in Oakview, you know, in 8 minutes you can walk to Publix, in 8 minutes you can walk to Lowe's. You know, we have all of those things, even though you are taking your life in your hands on 13th Street. So in my layman's eye, having more of these transect zones would lessen the distance between these little centers that you have pointed out to us, which then would encourage people who live in an area where the span between their home and their center is too great. Then if you had a transect zone, and it would make it more doable for them. And I understand that in the pristine setting, that if you and I sat down and designed a brand new city today, we could do those lovely gradients that are based on ecology and what have you. But when we're dealing with a city that's already here and has changed so incredibly, even in the last 5 years, let alone the history of the city, then in my mind, it made sense to allow a shorter span of distance between a person's home and those kind of facilities.
I think that for me, I would want to look at, and here is where I do think that policymakers have a role to play. And for instance, as you may recall from the meeting the other day, I briefly showed the city of Miami's map, which was done by Duane, I assume, or at least advocated by Duane Plater-Zyberk, who are located in Miami. They invented new urbanism, and Liz Plater-Zyberk was the dean at the University of Miami for many years. So they have thousands of architects in that area trained in new urbanism. If you look at the city of Miami's map, you'll see that they have, they allow density along the intercoastal waterway in that case, and along major transportation lines going back. There's a clear urban logic to it. So they are telling future developers, if you own land in this area, you can build something dense here. If you own land next to this area, you can try to get it incorporated into this more dense transect. But if you own land over here, you can't. And that, I think, is the role of professional planners and policymakers, to constrain growth in a way that makes sense, so it's not a free-for-all. Janice, you and I have both had the experience of seeing what happened on Seminary Lane. And that was a case, in my view, and as I've testified under oath, of poor decisions being made by the city in private, working with developers. And I think that without a very careful control of land use, that is what you get. And that's my concern.
I see. Well, boy,
yeah,
we won't go there. Well, we can. We understand.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, thank you so much. I still struggle with that, quite honestly, and I'll be very interested in continuing to follow that because we are so desperate for housing. We are so desperate. I will tell you quietly that I am housing somebody who was evicted and cannot find a place to live. And this is a resourceful person. This is a person who has a good job. And there is no place for this person to live other than under my roof.
Well,
It's terrible.
thank you, Janice.
Thank you, Abe.
Virginia Dolder? You can unmute when you.
Yeah,
Yes, great.
thank you for having this program, and a lot of it has been very informative. Some of it's way over my head, but the Sweetwater Branch development, do you know anything about that? What's going on with that? You talked a lot about the different water.
Yeah, do you mean the advocacy that some folks have made to connect to?
Exactly.
Yes, a little bit about it, and I think it's a great idea. For those who aren't following this story, the Sweetwater Branch is a stream or creek that begins essentially, as I understand it, pretty much under the Publix parking lot on North Main Street and extends through the duck pond, past the library and the Matheson Center, goes south a few blocks and then goes underground at GRU and reemerges in Spring Hill and makes its way past the wastewater treatment center and then into the Sweetwater Park and Paynes Prairie. So it drains into Paynes Prairie eventually, but it has a path along the way. Parts of it are undergrounded and parts of it are open. And I think that it would be a great idea to refurbish it. And for the same reason I said it would be great for everyone's conception of Gainesville to connect the headwaters of Hogtown Creek with Lake Kanapaha. For that same reason, it would be great to connect that Sweetwater Branch from the duck pond, if not from the Publix parking lot, to Paynes Prairie. And so I support doing that. And I think that in general, and what's called daylighting streams, where there are a lot of streams in urban areas that have been put underground for various reasons. And so daylighting them means letting them see daylight, uncovering them essentially. And the reason that it's being done nationally and really globally is because if we understand our environment, we're more likely to take care of it. And like Hogtown Creek is so polluted that it's not appropriate to even walk in it or touch the water. It's that polluted. The same may be true for Sweetwater Branch, but over time, if we begin to think of our waterways as a source of nourishment for the planet and for ourselves and for our own well systems, then we will do much better. So I think it should be considered as a continuing extended walkway or whatever. I think there would be lots of ways to do it, but I think it's a great idea.
But if part of it is under the parking lot at Publix, what do you do? I mean,
well, I think you can do that, at a certain point, and this is where you do the low hanging fruit. So maybe the areas where you can clean up the banks in the Southeast Historic District, you start there. You help Spring Hill and Duck Pond realize that they're part of the same creek system. And then there are other areas that would take more effort. For instance, parts of it go under GRU. And there's probably over the last 100 years been some toxicity in that area. So that might mean that you need to clean it up. There are grants to do that kind of thing. And there are great examples of that having been done. Our Depot Park was a brownfield site that was cleaned up. But I would start with the easy parts and then head toward the harder parts, including perhaps the public shopping center, although that could use some green amenities as well. Yeah. So I think we should consider that.
Thanks.
Jean Chalmers, good to see you.
Okay, just a few quick comments. Someone was talking about the difference in developing east and west. And as we know, this is karst topography here. In the east, I know of instances where there's 35 feet of clay under a very shallow buildable surface. So it's really not possible to build in a lot of those places in the east. And I just thought I should throw that in. You know, years ago, I worked for the Chamber of Commerce in New Jersey, of all places. And Long Island at that point had a boundary over urban boundaries. And beyond that, only agriculture was allowed. And this agricultural area was supposedly sufficient to feed, excuse me, to feed the people of those cities. And we are just destroying our farmlands that could be feeding the people of Gainesville. And I would just hope that all you sagacious folks would keep that in mind. I'm concerned about the lack of aesthetics in design. The square boxes with square apartments and just making streetscapes ugly. And I've lived in Vancouver and I've lived in New York City where it was fun to walk down the street. Buildings had wonderful facades and parks and trees. In Vancouver, for every story you add beyond a certain story, you have to put a certain amount of green space available within walking distance or right within the structure. We're not doing any of that in Gainesville. Years ago, we had an ordinance that said for any building that the city builds, 1.5% of that budget would go into artistic design. Is it legal? Could we do that with these developers that are building boxes? If anyone knows, let me know. And daylighting, yes, the Matheson Museum's heading that, and I'm so glad someone talked about it. It's exciting. And we see it going down to the Cotton Club. So I think we've got some nice things happening in our little town. Thank you so much, Kim, for all you do. Thanks, Jean.
Okay, thank you, Jean. Ed Bilarski, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I was pleased to get the invite. So I wanted to thank Kim and everyone else here for having this interesting dialogue. It shows me how much I don't know about urban design and planning. So I was thinking about one thing when Kim was talking about the fact that you basically don't have a blank sheet of paper. You have to work with what you have and you have to design around that. I mean, I think we certainly have an opportunity this particular year with the commission to do it from that side onward too. So if you had a blank sheet of paper there, what would you want, Kim, from the city commission, to facilitate some of these great ideas that you have? Because we can all talk as a group about it, but if you're not getting cooperation from the folks that are governing the city, we're going to have these conversations over and over again and people feeling like they're not part of the solution and they don't have a voice. So what advice would you have, moving into this?
A good question. Thank you. I think that there are sort of two things. There's not making things worse, which means
Do no harm.
do no harm. And that means because there are, I'm sure, hundreds of developments in the pipeline and some that could be looked at with more careful scrutiny, some that could be declined. And I don't know if moratoriums are possible, but certainly one of the issues before the City Commission now is bringing intermediate and major reviews back to the opportunity to the public for an opportunity for public input. We were told in the Seminary Lane project by our attorney that the city of Gainesville is now one of the only places he knows in Florida, maybe the only place, that big developments do not get any public scrutiny or opportunity to speak before they're approved. They're all approved right now at the staff level, which he works across the state, and it blew his mind that Gainesville of all places was like that. So I would reinstate reasonable public process. I would put the brakes on things that are being approved right now that truly should not be. But I think more broadly and proactively and positively, I think that, as I showed, this isn't just a city or county issue, it spans jurisdictions. And I think that if the city and county together could create a task force that was led by people, some staff or staffed by people, but led by citizens. And, just even on this call, there are lots of very informed and engaged people. That group might work for a year, and I would ask for a defined amount of staff time to do GIS mapping, and a defined amount of staff time to staff public workshops, real meaningful public workshops, and then that the commissioners themselves would attend those workshops, which they used to do in the early 2000s when I was involved. So long-term, and a data-driven, informed public process that spans jurisdictions, and short-term, try not to make things worse than they are now.
Great. Thank you so much. That gives you the context that I was looking for. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Bob Mounts, and those of you who haven't seen yet, Bob has yet another excellent editorial in today's Gainesville Sun.
Thank you, Abe. That was about the public's right to be heard and when, and Gail Johnson's request for an ordinance that would require that intermediate and major development plans be reviewed by the Development Review Board. And of course, the staff has been fighting against that. That's the subject of my article today. But I wanted to get back to the transect zone question that Janice asked about. And in practical terms, looking at the 3 coffee amendments that he was requesting for a 4.5 acre property, if there was a community conversation, about the how to develop South Main, now that you have the Cade Museum, you have the redesign of the safe streets of the road, which was funded, by the way, by College Park, University Heights, TIF funding, and the whole community there, the people that own those industrial properties and the brewery and the neighborhoods nearby, particularly Porter's Quarters, there needs to be a community conversation about how they would like that to look. And what we knew when the South Main Street project was completed was that transformed the area and gave the potential to have a much higher and best use, as they put it. Craig Carter was saying that highest and best use of that area is obviously not industrial, but it needs to affect, consider the needs of Kirkwood and all the neighborhoods around it and so forth, and have a conversation as to how we'd like it to look. If Mr. Coffey had gone in for transect zoning, there's about 9 different categories. He didn't have to ask for downtown zoning, 12 to 14 stories. He could have asked, if he'd asked for 4 to 6 stories, he might have gotten his wish. They claim they couldn't make the numbers work. But transect zoning allows a multitude of different types of uses under the Land Development Code and has other requirements. So you have a lot of different things that can go into it, but it really needs a larger area than 4.5 acres, which was the site they were looking at. So I think eventually, you could have a transect zone established for the area south of Depot Avenue that would be different. But many people think, including Harvard Ward, who said the other day that Depot Avenue is the boundary line for downtown zoning in the center part of Gainesville. South of that, it probably should be something else. And it'd probably be, you know, very beneficial for the owners that have those properties there if they were able to relocate and sell those properties and build whatever you want to build, probably nothing higher than 6 stories. So that's my comment. In practical terms, that's what you can do with the transect.
Okay, thanks very much, Bob, and for all you've done. As most of you know, Bob was the president of UPNA, the University Park Neighborhood Association, for several years, and did an enormous amount to expand our membership and our board and the involvement of many people across our neighborhoods as well as others. Tony and Carrie. Oliver Smith, good to see you.
Great. Okay, this is great. Thank you, Abe, for doing this, and for Kim. This is a terrific sort of seminar for those of us who are not really deeply involved in urban design. We're all concerned about it, of course, but I've got a kind of a global issue, but it underlies a lot of local questions. And it's certainly part of the local discourse in Gainesville about development, and particularly in regard to issues like affordable housing, as Janice brought up. And that is the tension, it seems to me, in development, no matter what the scale, always seems to be the tension between public interest and private capital. And that has certainly informed an awful lot of discussion about the development that's been taking place in terms of housing. But for example, Jean's comment about, you know, basically building buildings right to the edge of a sidewalk that they're in effect maximizing the use of space, but at what cost? And is it at the public cost? So what is the dynamic that is working out now in this explosive development that we've seen in Gainesville, in which if you don't go to a part of town for a month or two, when you go there, it all, you know, in some parts, it's not really recognizable anymore. So obviously, the financing for development can be public, but very often it's mostly private interest development, or driven rather. So
Right.
maybe just sort of comment upon that, not globally, but in the context of Gainesville.
Yeah, well, and I think part of the challenge that folks are having in Gainesville is that this is a national and even international phenomena right now. And Gainesville is experiencing the same things that people are other places. And we are not equipped to deal with it, because there are people who have spent their lives and have, you know, 10 MBAs apiece who are focused on this. And, you know, none of us have that understanding to think 3 steps ahead, which is what others are doing. Tony, I think a while ago you taught me the term neoliberal, which means, as Tony mentioned or explained to me, the idea that well-intentioned liberals like me have, although not me, that capitalists will do the right thing with money, essentially. That you said it much more succinctly, but, and maybe you should say it so I don't leave misimpressions.
Well,
define neoliberalism.
no, neoliberalism.
In 2 sentences, because I still want to answer your question.
Neoliberalism is in effect a kind of return to the classical liberal idea that the pursuit of self-interest, without any intention of the individual, will serve the public purpose. And that's straight from Adam Smith. And Adam Smith, being a clergyman, was very concerned about the moral implications of that. But basically, the neoliberals do not address that. for them, public interest will always be served by private initiative. And that in effect opens the door to a universe of misapplications. And in the context that I work, it in effect opens the door to the creation of, say, public housing in high-risk zones. Why? Because the land in high-risk zones is very cheap. And so they can claim that they are serving public interest, but in effect, they're simply transferring risk.
Yeah.
So these are the kinds of things that I think underlie a lot of the questions that we've been circulating this afternoon, and
Yeah.
really productively. So anyway.
So just as one example of that, there is a site right now behind the Royal Park Theater that is about 95% within a FEMA floodplain.
Yep.
It is about to be redeveloped as affordable housing. And of course, it's going to flood because that's why we have floodplains. And so the people who will suffer are the people who are the renters there, who don't have rental insurance, but whose cars will flood or whose apartments will flood, and all the people downstream who will be affected by further flooding because that site is not going to act as a floodplain anymore. That's a local example. So that's one thing. And there are other cases where people are talking about building in floodplains in Gainesville that I've heard about. And of course, what happens, and we've seen this in other parts of Gainesville, is naive people come and buy property or rent, and it seems like a good deal. It's cheaper, it's affordable. And the people who agreed to it are long gone by the time their lives are wrecked. And we could mention other examples in East Gainesville, but that one is one that's active right now. The other thing that I would say is with regard to financing is half of Gainesville is in an opportunity zone, which is a rollover from the Obama enterprise zones, but I don't really understand the way they work, and I'm not sure anyone does. So everything east of 13th Street, possibly except for Grove Street and Oakview, is in an opportunity zone. And that means that there are tax advantages for multinational developers or consortiums of investors to make money with all of those properties, and they are.
And so they are offered an opportunity with tax advantages. And in effect, in maximizing the return on their investment, they have a set of immediate goals, but the long-term goals of the city don't figure into those calculations. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to be seeing with the housing that's around the university. And
Yeah.
so 6 or 8 blocks in either direction.
As Jean pointed out, they're built to the sidewalks, and that's part of the new urban form-based code language. But if you look at the floor plans, and I look carefully at Seminary Lane, they have packed so many students in. It's a horrifying kind of a warehouse for young people. And we're hearing with other of those developments that they're not well built, et cetera, et cetera. So it's exactly that. And with Seminary Lane, the person who worked it through the city process sold it to another company to build it, and another company still will manage it, as I understand. So there's there are no fingerprints on that project
Yeah, okay.
already.
Thanks a lot. That's great. Good examples.
Thanks, Tony. Bob?
Sure. Abe, thanks for having Kim come and organizing this. So good to be learn more. Kim, my issue is this. You mentioned a few times highlands, recharge areas. Now, we're pretty good about watching, hey, behind Royal Park, it's a floodplain. East Gainesville has a lot of wetlands. We understand to protect them, but the highlands often get neglected, and that's an area that isn't as tightly controlled in zoning. I'll give one example. You comment on what we can do to protect it more. About a dozen years ago, Walmart tried to build a large project where Home Depot is located on 13th Street. Now, 10 dozen acres of that were already zoned commercial. That was actually zoned by a judge, and be that as it may, that was already commercial. Walmart's plan was to pave over 60 acres of the headwaters of Hogtown Creek. I led the coalition against them. Pleased to say, we won that one after a multi-year battle. Because if we had paved over the headwaters of Hogtown Creek, it would be an ecological disaster down the creek as it goes dry. We already have enough trouble with septic tanks, etc., draining in there. And that would have been a great disaster. And then Home Depot, as a good citizen, donated a large piece of that land, which is now the beautiful Hogtown Creek Park. So what can we do to better protect our recharge areas, our highlands? They seem to be neglected because the focus is on lowlands.
Well, that's a good question. And you're absolutely right that if you pave uphill, the water goes downhill. That's the force of gravity. That's the way it works. And I first came to learn that problem when I was in North Carolina as a student many years ago. There was a shopping mall between Raleigh and Durham called the Crabtree Valley Shopping Center, and it was built in a floodplain. And there was a flood, and it flooded the entire shopping center and adjacent car sales, facilities. So there were Cadillacs floating around in the water, and it became clear that what had happened was there had been so much paving uphill from that floodplain that of course all the water dropped into the floodplain. So this is a well-known fact. At that time, or soon thereafter, they built a reservoir to retain water upstream from there, which I guess is still effective. In a place like Gainesville, that wouldn't be prudent. There are streams all over the place, and the water flows into both Hogtown Creek and to the Noonan's Lake watershed, as I now understand, from all kinds of directions. When I first came to Gainesville, I was on the Development Review Board, and Gainesville reviewed every site plan for its floodwater ponds, and every site had to retain, and I don't remember what the amount is, but some number of inches of water from a 100-year storm on site for a certain period of time, with the idea that the water would percolate back into the ground and into the aquifer eventually on site rather than flowing downhill. Since that time, in all of these downturn urban areas, there are no, and the new build developments in particular, there are not what are called these low impact developments. So there's no visible stormwater protection. What I am told is that they are providing kind of cisterns underwater that provide the same amount of water retention. And I don't know, and we're not going to know until there's a storm. But I think if we're considering resilience, we need to just assume that there will be, that the 100-year storm will happen every 3 years. The 500-year storm might happen 2 years in a row. And we need to provide more site storage on retention and build less at the site, which gets back to what Jean Chalmers is saying. Rather than having you can build, like right now in the city code, in the urban transect, which is the part that was some of us feared would be plopped down anywhere. I think your site coverage can be, I don't remember, but it's something like 80 or 90% of the site can have impervious surface. So only 10% is restraining water. And I do not think that's sufficient. I think in a certain way, every tub should be on its own bottom, and you should keep all the water on site, and you should celebrate that it's there and recognize that it's there. So that's a policy solution, but in my field, it's also believed to be an educational solution. At the University of Virginia, they've just daylighted a creek, and they're reconsidering that whole creek system so that people, and at my building, the School of Architecture, there was low impact design so that people would understand what happens to water when it rains. So I think education's part of it and good policy is part of it. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think one last live question from Don. Fields?
Thank you. My question sort of builds on what Mayor Chalmers talked about, and that was New York City, and it's in part informed by what Bob Mounts was talking about, which was the presentation of the development of the southwest corner of Depot Park area. And the question it also kind of comes from the life and death of the cities as well. And so taking New York, it's one of our older cities, and it really has developed over a couple hundred years from some small rural type area to what it is now. And it has good points and it has insecure points and so on. So what are the successes and failures that city has had? Which ones should we try to avoid, and how? And some kind of history of where Gainesville is in the life and death, and I wonder what a death of a city looks like. Thank you for any of your comments in advance.
Well, that's a very good question, but a very big question. So I don't know that I could even begin to answer it. I think that I'll just say a few things that I think are good lessons for any newer city like Gainesville from New York. And that includes, of course, walkability and the fact that there are neighborhoods. Yes, there's all that density, but if you live in New York, you know your neighborhood. And so that speaks to how far do you go on a daily basis? No one walks. I believe that the island of Manhattan is the length of Gainesville, maybe from downtown to the town of Tioga or something. No one walks the length of Manhattan normally. So you walk your little area. And I think that recognizing that is one thing. One good lesson. For all of us, there is the question of sustainability, and friends who live in New York who are real experts in sustainability talk about the fact that that the city, because it's so big, is sustainable because a lot of people live there, which allows for the watersheds that June talked about. I grew up adjacent to a watershed for the New York metropolitan area. So there was lots of perpetually protected watersheds because there was that landscape. They did that 100 years ago. I don't know that it could be done now, but that was a good lesson. For me, the other thing though is that, and there are people probably who haven't spent much time in New York City who are comparing parts of Gainesville to New York City. And if you have spent much time in New York City, you know that they're not like each other. And you can't kind of create an instant city in 3 years out of 2x4s with brick facades and, call it a city. So the other lesson is that there's only one New York City, which is why we recognize it as such. And I think what we need to do is, I have friends and colleagues who have written many books about New York City, so I can't even begin to say all the good lessons there are. There are many good lessons, including programs and retrofitting and so forth. There are also horrendous lessons, which I could also go into. But I think for us to start with what we have and to find value when possible in what we have is smart, and it's why many of us have chosen to live here. We like Gainesville. I've lived in New York City and I don't want to live there. That's why I live in Gainesville. And so for us to just reinforce and improve what we have seems smarter. And for those of us who are cost conscious, it's also cheaper, because if you start from scratch, you're building new, if you're renovating, you can take advantage of all the assets around you if you know how to see them as assets. And that was the example that I gave from Curia on the Drag and from Satchel's and from many other places. I mean, even the Nopal restaurant, that was a funny little strip shopping center, and they had the wisdom to build a deck over the Hogtown Creek. They saw an asset where no one had before. So for us, the goal, I think, should be recognize and celebrate what we have and go from there. Thanks for the question.
Good. Thank you very much. Just before we end, we've really imposed on your time.
All of our time.
I'll add one massive question that maybe you can answer very quickly if you choose.
Sure.
As you know, the city's comprehensive plan advocates eliminating single-family zoning. I would guess that virtually everyone on this meeting lives in a single-family zoned neighborhood area, even though those of us near the university know that actually half of the dwellings are rentals at this point. Do you think that eliminating single-family zoning will achieve either of the two objectives that they claim, which is to redress racial inequities and to generate significant amounts of new affordable housing, depending on for whom they are affordable? I'm sorry, that's a...
Well, the very short answer would be no, comma, absolutely no. To expand a little bit, let me say that as some of you know, this is a idea that was floated by some of our young progressives nationally around 2018. And it was going to solve all problems at once. And so what we have seen in cities that have that were ahead of us in making changes, in Minneapolis, they, in their more single family neighborhoods, went from 2 dwelling units that were currently allowed on a site to 3. After years of discussion and getting a lot of buy-in from the people who live there, some of whom I've spoken with. And in Gainesville, we, most of us supported allowing new accessory dwelling units on single family properties. My husband and I have one. We don't rent it, but we have one from the 1930s when our house was built. And there are an unknown number of accessory dwelling units across the city already. So again, the city doesn't know what it had prior to 2 years ago. And then about a year and a half ago, at 11 o'clock at night, they passed an ordinance allowing not 1, but 2 accessory dwelling units on properties. So as of now, Gainesville has matched Minneapolis in terms of the number of dwelling units on one property, and single family zoning was eliminated at that time. To go further, and the current proposal is to allow up to 12 dwelling units per acre on any property in the city, would, I believe, just randomly wreck the city, basically. And there's really no way of telling where it might happen. There are some newer lots in some lots in newer subdivisions that are acre or acre and a half lots. So one developer from Argentina could, or Barcelona could buy a property and add 17 additional housing units on one property in, say, Featherwood. Conversely, in places that have smaller lots, and the most targeted areas right now are Porter's Quarters and the Pleasant Street neighborhood, the lots are much, much smaller, but you could have, on those lots, you could have, you could gang several together, and they don't even have to be contiguous. And you could say, this is my new development. I have 2/3 of an acre, so I'm going to put 9 units here, and they can go wherever they go. In the Seminary Lane project, there were 5 acres of property, but the units were not distributed according to the acreage. They were distributed as the developer chose because it was bundled as one development. So with construction costs what they are, even if the land were free, we would be talking about something like $150,000 per unit for just building it, plus land costs and other things like that, which means it won't be deeply affordable. One of the problems, as some of you know, is the term affordable is used for to refer to people who are deeply in need of housing. And those are people who make probably less than 30% of the area median income, but certainly less than 50%. Some are on disability, et cetera. But there's also a whole cohort that makes around the average, but they want to live in affordable houses in certain neighborhoods. And they are, in my view, naive to think that those houses will be built for them and that the developer, rather than making a profit, will give the benefit to them. And with regard to racial equity, if you look at maps across the last 20 years, Gainesville's population is pretty diverse across the city, not in every neighborhood certainly, but across the city. And if our goal is to make sure, and to me it's kind of, I don't know, crude to talk about this way, but if somehow there's a goal to have a Black family in every neighborhood, then there are ways to do that without, wrecking every neighborhood, hoping that a Black family will move in. So I don't think it will solve either of those problems, and it will just randomly wreck neighborhoods in the meantime.
Well, that was a very concise and to the point response. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. We have made a recording of this, and we will try to figure out how to get it on. We actually have, I found out, a YouTube channel for UPNA, and we will try to do that with Kim's consent. Also, those of you, there have been many comments on the chat, which I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to get to. But if you haven't done this in the past, you can save the chat comments yourself to your own computer. If you click on the chat button and you go to the bottom right-hand side, at least on my computer, where the three little dots, it gives you the option to save that chat, and it will appear eventually as a text, just sequence of all the chat comments. So, Kim, thank you so much. This has really been, I'm sure it's been a little bit exhausting for you, but it's been very stimulating and very informative. And thank you, everyone who's joined us. It's really been good to see you, and it's good to have a neighborhood.
Yeah, thanks, Abe and Saeed, for your help, and UPNA for all of your help. And thanks, everybody, for participating.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.